Hello, this is constitutional attorney Catherine Henry. Welcome to this week's Biblical Insight segment. This week we talked about quite a few things. We walked you through what the main cases of the freedom fighting topic this week are. We highlighted some documents. We discussed what is happening now. What was I talking about? I was talking about three different cases. These three cases that have been or are in the Michigan Court of Appeals and or Michigan Supreme Court. Of course, these cases, we were talking about three main sets of laws in the state of Michigan. Of course, the 1945 Emergency Powers of Governor Act, the 1976 Emergency Management Act, and the 1976 Public Health Code. Of that, there's two main statutes, 333.2253 and 333.2453. So 2253 and 2453. And the reason why we're talking about that now in our biblical insight is because the challenges that have been made to the EOs issued by the governor and then by the MDHHS director under these various statutes is that, at least let me just put it this way, the challenges that I have raised since day one have been that the executive branch is going outside of the scope of its authority and it's acting where it is not allowed or permitted to do. So the 1945 Emergency Powers of Governor Act, it purported to give the governor power to exercise, these restrictions upon the people in terms of using executive orders, EOs. And of course, October 2nd, 2020, our Supreme Court reminded us or declared, however you want to look at it, that the governor did in fact step outside of the bounds and violate Article 3, Section 2 of our state constitution and the separation of powers clause. And so that statute itself doesn't have authority. It was declared to be unconstitutional. Then that 1976 statute, of course, in that case, the governor's orders were deemed to have violated that law, and the court didn't touch whether that statute itself was constitutional. And the Supreme Court so far has declined to be clear about whether the Public Health Code, or at least those two provisions, violate the Constitution. But anyway, we need to look at this in the context of what these orders did. Of course, they're changing everything about our lives. They have talked about whether or not we're able to go to church or where that has to be, or going to work, whether we have an essential business or not, whether we're allowed to buy, seeds or paint or, housing supplies, whether we're allowed to, gather for any kind of reason at our home or, in public, inside or outside. And of course, you can face jail time and steep civil fines, penalties, you name it, if you violate these orders. Well, looking at what the Bible says in Romans 2, verse 13, it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Okay, so obeying the law, like I mentioned, that 1945 law, wasn't as specific about how the governor was supposed to issue those initial set of EOs as the 1976 law, but she was using both and they did work together. They have to be read together. And that 1976 law was very clear that even if her orders were okay from day one, she violated the state statute, that 1976 EMA, because she was trying to use her EOs after that time period essentially reaffirmed or put into place for an extension by the legislature in Michigan. So after April 30th, 2020, she was violating the very law that she was claiming to be using. So she was not obeying the law. In fact, in any of this, if there's constitutional violations, if the EOs or the statutes themselves violate the Constitution, then they're not obeying the law, because after all, what is the Constitution? It is the supreme law of the land. Romans 13:1 and verse 5 as well talk about us submitting to the governing authorities, not just a particular government official, but of the governing authorities that we need to look at then. What is the authority for government to act? Well, as we've talked about many times before, if the Constitution, the U.S. or Michigan Constitution, does not specifically provide authority for the government to act in a certain way, then they don't have that authority. They don't have rights or powers or authorities all unto their own. No, we, the people, are the ones that have our individual God-given liberties. We have that authority, that sovereign authority, and we have given the government only bits and pieces of authority and power as we have seen fit in our U.S. and Michigan constitutions. So when we are submitting to the governing authority, we are submitting to what is put in place by those constitutions, not just any official, government official who steps outside of the bounds of what the Constitution has literally authorized them to do. So, looking at Romans 13, verse 7, it says, give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So what do you owe the government? Do you owe it to the governor to follow her executive orders and now these MDHHS EOs? No, you don't owe them that, because they're not following the law, and they're certainly not following the supreme law of the land or Constitution. You don't owe it to them to follow these. In fact, you owe it to your fellow neighbor, your fellow citizen, your children, your grandchildren, yourself, to not follow those unconstitutional EOs. If you look at Isaiah 1:17, in talking to the people of a rebellious nation, Isaiah said, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor. We are being told not to blindly follow whatever government mandates might be thrown at us, but to seek justice and, in fact, rebuke the oppressor, ward off that oppression. Ezekiel 11, verse 1, 2, and 4 talks about, when the leaders of the people, when those government officials are giving wicked advice in the city or telling us to do wrong, they're going astray. God calls us out to speak out against them, to speak the right word at the right time, in the right way, to fight the good fight. Don't just fight back, but fight the good fight. Do it in the right way. And that is what all of these episodes on Restore Freedom Weekly, all the segments are geared toward, to enabling you to best fight for freedom in the right way. So what about that governing authority? What about the law? What does the law say? Again, the law, the supreme law of the land, as we see in Article 6 of our U.S. Constitution, the Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land. And the laws and the constitutions of the states have to follow the U.S. Constitution. These executive orders, emergency orders, they're unconstitutional. They're not following the supreme law of the land. They are not following or abiding by the authority actually given to them. They're stepping outside of the bounds of the authority because they're violating the separation of powers. They are violating due process by all of these segments we talked about before. They are violating the due process owed specifically to us as individuals by having our property and our freedom deprived without that due process of law. Impairment of contract. These EOs have clearly impaired our contracts with our employees, with our vendors, with much of what we do in the business world. Everything we do in the business world was impacted by these EOs in some way. These EOs also violate the equal protection clauses of the Constitution, treating certain kinds of businesses differently than others, and certainly by how they were actually played out, where, some restaurants were allowed to be open and have groups of people sitting next to each other in massive quantities, not wearing masks, as we saw when the governor was doing it herself in 2020 and beyond, while at the same time, she was ordering everybody else to abide by, the mask mandates and to not have the restaurants opened at certain capacities, etc. What about assembly, consultation, instruction, and petitioning our government? Well, these EOs stopped us. Literally, that one statute, the Public Health Code, is specifically allowing the MDHHS director or the local health department to issue orders that prohibit the gathering of the people for any purpose. Well, that is unconstitutional. It's obviously word for word unconstitutional. You can't restrict the right of the people to peaceably assemble. So certainly, if the legislature is creating a law that supposedly allows a government official to do that, let alone the government officials are actually issuing these EOs that try to do that, that is not an authority they have. The Constitution says, no, you don't have the authority to do that. They are also impacting our freedom of worship and against unreasonable searches and seizures, where our unenumerated rights are not being protected and respected, where there's total ignoring of the fact that power is inherent in the people. Clearly, our government, by issuing these EOs, is going astray, is stepping outside of the bounds of what their authority to them was actually given to them in the U.S. and Michigan constitutions. And when our rights are to be exercised, undiminished, unrestrained, unabridged, uninfringed, unviolated, undenied, undeprived, unabused, and unusurped, and yet that is the entirety of what these EOs are trying to do, is to restrain, diminish our rights, abridge our rights, infringe upon our rights, violate them outright, deny them, deprive us of them, abusing and usurping those protections for them. Well, then clearly there is no authority. So, let's take a step back to what these parts of the Bible are telling us. God's word tells us to obey the law. Let's do that. Let's obey the supreme law of the land. Let's submit to the governing authorities, not just government officials, but the office that has that constitutional authority and the acts of the officer in those positions that are following along with the authority given to them by the constitutions. Give the government what you owe them. Don't just think you owe it to the governor or the legislature or your health department or the government in general to follow their every whim and dictate. You only owe them what is required, what's really required. And we're not required to abide by laws, rules, or regulations, mandates, EOs, anything that are unconstitutional, that deprive us of our God-given liberties. We need to seek justice and rebuke the oppressor in these situations. We need to speak out against these government officials. We need to stop it from happening. With all this being said, I want you to remember, take advantage of the resources we have. Go listen to the main episode of the week again, or that constitutional segment recap. Think about the Wednesday Way to Get Involved challenge, or taking a look at diving into those Friday's freedom fighting tools. But think about the EOs and how they've restricted us, and the fact that they are not constitutional, and what the Bible in fact tells us about following the law, and not just those government officials, but the governing authority. So I hope that this is helpful in ending this last week and our discussions on it. I invite you, of course, to tune into our show at noon this coming Tuesday for week 15's full episode. And of course, on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of next week for those particular segments. I also ask you to go ahead and fill out that survey we've been posting on social media for the question I'm putting forth to you guys: if I should be pursuing working in, on amicus briefs in the cases we talked about this week, or I should say the most recent case we talked about. But thank you, as always, for joining, and I wish you a wonderful rest